December 20th, 1943. 11:42 a.m. RAF, Hethel, Norfolk, England. Elevation 312 feet. The wind cuts across the East Anglian flatlands like a razor blade dipped in ice water. It is a gray, miserable morning, the kind of English weather that seeps through the shearling of a B-3 bomber jacket and settles deep in the marrow. Standing at the edge of the hard stand, Master Sergeant Frank Sparky Miller doesn't feel the cold. He is too busy listening. He wipes a smear of grease from his cheek with a rag that is arguably dirtier than his face. His eyes, rimmed with red from 3 days of sleepless shifting, scan the low-hanging cloud layer to the east. The air smells of damp earth, unburned high-octane aviation fuel, and the stale copper tang of impending bad news. "They're late," Corporal D'Angelo mutters, kicking at a tuft of frozen grass near the Jeep. 30 minutes past the ETA. Maybe the headwinds over the channel slowed them down. Frank doesn't answer. He knows the headwinds were negligible. He knows the target was Bremen, and he knows that the Luftwaffe has moved 3 new wings of FW-190s into the corridor. Then the sound comes. It isn't the deep, rhythmic thrum of a healthy formation. It is a ragged, sputtering growl. It sounds like a tractor dying in a mud pit. "Here they come," Frank says, his voice gravelly. The first B-24 Liberator breaks through the overcast. It's flying crabwise, the nose fighting the wind, fighting the aerodynamics, fighting gravity itself. Then another, then a gap where 2 planes should be, then another. Frank counts them down. The Witch, Old Ironsides, Lucky Lady. They are battered, smoke trailing from engines, ragged holes punched through their vertical stabilizers, but they are flying. "Where's Ragged Irregular?" D'Angelo asks, stepping closer to the edge of the tarmac. Frank tightens his grip on the rag. Ragged Irregular is ship number 42-7493. It's the squadron's problem child, a heavy, lumbering beast that Frank has nursed through 20 missions. He replaced the number 3 supercharger just last night. There, Frank points, low, dangerously low. The B-24 bursts out of the mist less than 300 feet off the deck. It is a flying wreck. The right wing is dipping violently. Smoke is pouring black and thick from the number 3 engine, the very one Frank fixed. But it's the fuselage that makes D'Angelo gasp. There is a hole in the waist section you could drive a Jeep through. Daylight is visible through the other side. "Get the meat wagon," Frank barks, jumping into the driver's seat of the Cletrac tractor. "And get the fire crew rolling. He's coming in hot, and he's got no flaps." The massive bomber hits the runway hard. Rubber screeches, sending up plumes of blue smoke. The left landing gear collapses instantly. The giant 30-ton bird slews sideways, metal screaming against tarmac, sparks showering like a grand finale on the 4th of July. It skids for 1,000 feet, carving a trench in the mud alongside the runway before coming to a groaning, shuddering halt. For a second, there is silence. Just the ticking of cooling metal and the hiss of steam. Then the sirens start. Frank is the first one at the wreck. He ignores the heat radiating from the buckled engine cowlings. He's looking for the crew. The waist door is jammed, twisted by the torque of the crash. He grabs a crowbar from the tractor and jams it into the seam, heaving with every ounce of strength in his 160-pound frame. "Come on, you pig," he screams at the aluminum. With a screech of tearing metal, the door pops. A waist gunner tumbles out, coughing, covered in hydraulic fluid. Then the pilot, Lieutenant Holloway, slides down, looking pale and shaking. "Everyone out?" Frank yells. "Tail gunner took shrapnel," Holloway gasps, wiping soot from his eyes. "We patched him up, but he needs a doctor." As the medics swarm the plane, Frank steps back. He isn't looking at the men anymore. They are safe. His job is the machine. He walks around the tail section, his boots crunching on glass and plexiglass shards. He stops at the waist section. He looks up at the damage that nearly tore the plane in half midair. It wasn't just a 20-millimeter cannon shell. It looks like a direct hit from an 88-millimeter flak burst that failed to detonate but punched clean through the structural ribs. The longeron, the main spinal cord of the aircraft's fuselage, is severed. The aluminum skin is shredded like wet tissue paper. The plane is sagging in the middle, its back broken. Captain Reynolds, the engineering officer, pulls up in a Willys Jeep. He is a man who loves clipboards and hates improvisation. He steps out, adjusts his pristine cap, and looks at the wreck. He doesn't need to inspect it closely. He's seen enough dead birds. "Write it off, Sergeant," Reynolds says, pulling a red tag from his pocket. "Salvage the instruments and the guns. Send the engines to the depot if they aren't seized. The rest goes to the boneyard." Frank looks at the captain, then back at the plane. "Captain, we're down to 12 operational ships. Briefing says we have a max effort tomorrow." "I know the numbers, Miller," Reynolds snaps, "but look at it. The longeron is snapped. The stress load on the fuselage is compromised. You can't patch a structural break like that without a factory jig and a week in a hangar we don't have. It's scrap." Reynolds ties the red "condemned" tag to the twisted metal of the waist window. He climbs back into his Jeep, starts stripping it at 1300. Frank stands alone in the cold wind. He runs a hand over the jagged, torn aluminum. It's cold, sharp, and smells of violence. He looks at the "condemned" tag fluttering in the breeze. He thinks about the boys who fly these things. He thinks about the replacement planes that are currently stuck in Iceland due to storms. He thinks about the fact that if they don't put up a full squadron tomorrow, the formation will be loose and the Focke-Wulfs will tear them apart. Frank pulls a pair of welding goggles from his pocket and hangs them around his neck. He reaches into his coveralls, pulls out a piece of chalk, and draws a large X over the captain's red tag. "Not today," he whispers to the broken machine. "Not today." December 20th, 1943, 1:15 p.m., Squadron Supply Hut, RAF, Hethel. The supply hut smells of wet wool, stale coffee, and bureaucracy. It is a small, corrugated steel Nissen hut, shivering in the wind, filled with rows of empty shelving and a single, overworked teletype machine clacking away in the corner. Frank Miller slams the black Bakelite receiver down onto the cradle so hard, the bell inside jingles. 3 weeks, Frank says, his voice flat. He stares at the wall map of the Atlantic, dotted with pins representing convoys. Depot at Burtonwood says they have the rivets, they have the sheet aluminum, but they don't have a single starboard longeron assembly for a B-24D. Not in the whole damn United Kingdom. Corporal D'Angelo is sitting on a crate of .50 caliber ammunition, eating a tin of cold Spam with a pocket knife. He doesn't look surprised. "Frank, the Atlantic is a shooting gallery right now," D'Angelo says, chewing slowly. "The U-boats sank 3 supply ships last week. Even if the part was afloat, it's probably at the bottom of the ocean. We've got what we've got." Frank rubs his temples. This is the reality of the 8th Air Force in the winter of '43. The public back home sees newsreels of endless production lines in Detroit and Willow Run, bombers rolling off the assembly line every hour. But here, 4,000 miles away, the supply chain is a thin, brittle thread. A broken bolt can ground a bomber for a month. A snapped longeron is a death sentence for the airframe. "We can't wait 3 weeks, Frank mutters. Reynolds is right. By the book, she's scrap metal. The door to the hut bangs open, letting in a gust of freezing mist and the roar of an engine test down the line. The room snaps to attention. It's Colonel Ironhead Vance. The group commander looks like he hasn't slept in a week. His flight jacket is stained with oil, and his eyes are hard flint. He doesn't salute. He doesn't stand on ceremony. He walks straight to Frank's desk and drops a mission folder on top of the requisition forms. "At ease," Vance barks, though his tone suggests anything but ease. "Miller, Captain Reynolds tells me you put an X on Ragged Irregular. He tells me you think you can save her." Frank swallows. He feels D'Angelo's eyes on him. "I didn't say I could save her, Colonel. I said I wasn't ready to scrap her yet." Vance leans over the desk. He smells of high-altitude sweat and tobacco. "I just got off the secure line with Bomber Command. Tomorrow isn't just another milk run. We're hitting the rail yards at Osnabrück. Deep penetration. High fighter density." Vance pauses, letting the weight of the words settle. "I need 21 aircraft, Sergeant. I have 20. If Ragged Irregular doesn't fly, I have to scratch a flight element. That means 3 other planes lose their wingman. That means the defensive box has a hole in it. And that means men die." The colonel's voice drops to a whisper, but it carries more weight than a shout. "I don't care about the engineering manual, Miller. I don't care about Captain Reynolds' regulations. I need that plane on the line at 0600. Can you do it?" Frank looks at the colonel, then down at the empty requisition form. Standard procedure demands he say no. The structural integrity of the fuselage is compromised. To fix it properly, he needs a factory-made splice plate, heat-treated aluminum alloy, and a specialized riveting jig. He has none of those things. If he tries to patch it and the tail shears off at 20,000 feet, the death of 10 men will be on his conscience forever. But if he doesn't fix it, the formation flies loose. Frank thinks about the hole in the waste section. He thinks about the scrap pile behind Hangar 3, the graveyard where the carcasses of dead bombers are stripped for parts. "The book says it's impossible, sir," Frank says slowly. "I'm not asking the book," Vance replies. "I'm asking the best mechanic in the 8th Air Force." Frank takes a deep breath. He picks up his gloves. "I can't get you a factory repair, Colonel, but if you keep Captain Reynolds out of my hair for the next 12 hours, I'll give you a plane that flies." Vance nods, a grim sort of smile touching his lips. "Reynolds is on administrative leave until tomorrow morning. You have the hangar. You have the night. Don't let me down, Sparky." Vance turns and marches out into the cold. D'Angelo drops his tin of Spam. "Frank, have you lost your mind? A structural longeron? We don't have the steel. We don't have the braces. How the hell are we going to splice the spine of a B-24 with nothing but scrap?" Frank grabs his toolbox. His mind is already racing, visualizing the geometry of the airframe, deconstructing the problem into angles and stress loads. He isn't thinking like a mechanic anymore. He's thinking like an inventor. "Get the torch, D'Angelo," Frank says, heading for the door. "And grab the heavy cutters. We're going to the graveyard." "The graveyard?" D'Angelo scrambles to follow. "What for?" "We're going to steal a spine," Frank says, pushing out into the wind. "And then we're going to do some welding that would make the Boeing engineers have a heart attack." December 20th, 1943, 2:45 p.m. The Graveyard, Aircraft Salvage Area, RAF Hethel. The graveyard is a silent, ghostly place on the far perimeter of the airfield. Here, the war doesn't roar, it rusts. The skeletons of a dozen B-24s sit in the tall grass, picked clean of engines, guns, and instruments. They look like the carcasses of great aluminum whales washed ashore. The wind whistles through open gun ports and flaps against torn control surfaces. It is eerie, but Frank Miller doesn't have time for ghosts. He climbs up through the shattered nose wheel well of a bomber named Double Trouble, which had belly landed 2 weeks ago. D'Angelo follows, dragging the heavy oxyacetylene torch cart through the mud, cursing under his breath. "Frank, I don't get it," D'Angelo grunts, wiping mud from his face. "You can't weld the longeron. It's duralumin. You put a torch to that, and you ruin the heat treatment. It'll turn brittle and snap like a pretzel the first time the pilot pulls G's." Frank is deep inside the fuselage, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. He runs his hand along the spine of the wrecked plane. It's twisted, just like Ragged Irregular. No good. "We aren't going to weld the aluminum, D'Angelo," Frank calls out, his voice echoing in the hollow tube. "We're going to bypass it." Frank climbs back out and walks toward a pile of twisted scrap metal near the fence. He starts kicking through debris, crushed wing spars, bent propeller blades, and twisted armor plating. He stops at a long, heavy piece of L-shaped steel. It's a section of a bomb bay vertical rack, the heavy steel track designed to hold 1,000-pound demolition bombs in place under extreme turbulence. "This," Frank says, tapping the steel with his boot. "This is our longeron." D'Angelo stares at it. "That's steel, Frank. High-carbon steel. It weighs 3 times as much as the aluminum spar. And you can't rivet that to the skin. It's too thick." "Exactly," Frank says, kneeling in the mud to measure it with his hands. "The manual says we need to replace the aluminum longeron with a factory aluminum splice. We don't have one. So, we're going to build a splint." Frank grabs a piece of chalk and draws a diagram on the rusted flank of a dead bomber for D'Angelo to see. "Look, the longeron on Ragged Irregular is snapped here." Frank marks a break. "If we try to rivet a patch, the stress concentration will tear the rivets out. But if we take this steel bomb rack, cut it into 2 4-foot sections, and weld them together into a U-channel." "You want to make a sleeve?" D'Angelo realizes. "A steel sleeve," Frank confirms. "We fit it over the broken aluminum spine. We bolt it through with high-strength shear bolts. The steel takes the load. The aluminum just goes along for the ride." D'Angelo looks at the heavy steel beam. Frank, the engineering officer would have you court-martialed. Mixing steel and aluminum? Galvanic corrosion will eat that airframe alive in a month. Frank stands up, his eyes hard. D'Angelo, look at these planes. He gestures to the broken skeletons around them. None of them lasted a month. We don't need Ragged Irregular to last a year. We don't need her to be airworthy for inspection in 1945. We need her to fly tomorrow. He grabs the torch igniter. Spark it up. We're cutting. For the next 2 hours, the graveyard is lit by the blue-white hiss of the cutting torch. Frank moves with surgical precision, slicing through the heavy steel of the bomb rack. Sparks cascade over his boots, sizzling in the wet grass. He cuts 2 identical 4-foot lengths. Then he cuts cross braces. He isn't just repairing a plane. He is redesigning it. He is taking the brute strength of a bomb rack and forcing it to do the delicate job of an airframe spine. By the time they load the hot steel into the back of the Jeep, the sun has set. The base is plunged into the blackout. No lights allowed. They have to drive back to the hangar in pitch darkness, guiding the Jeep by the faint contrast of the runway against the grass. As they bounce over the ruts, Frank holds the warm steel on his lap. It's heavy. It's crude. It's ugly. It's going to throw the center of gravity off, D'Angelo warns, driving with his head out the side window. We'll trim it out, Frank says. Tell the crew to leave the waste gun's ammo boxes half full. That'll compensate. You're making this up as you go, aren't you? That's what we do, kid, Frank says, looking at the dark outline of the hangar ahead. That's what we do. December 20th, 1943, 11:30 p.m., Hangar 4, RAF Hethel. The hangar is a cathedral of shadows and noise. The blackout curtains are drawn tight, sealing in the acrid haze of cigarette smoke and welding fumes. Inside, portable work lights cast long, jagged shadows against the corrugated walls. Under the belly of Ragged Irregular, it looks like a scene from a shipyard. Frank lies on his back inside the fuselage, his body contorted into a space meant for ammo boxes, not a grown man. Sweat stings his eyes. The air inside the aluminum tube is thick with the smell of ozone and fear. Hold it steady, Frank yells over the scream of the pneumatic drill. You're slipping. Outside the plane, D'Angelo and 2 other mechanics, Grease and Miller, no relation, are heaving against the steel splint, trying to force the heavy bomb rack channel over the broken aluminum spine. It's a brutal, physical fight. The steel doesn't want to bend. The aluminum doesn't want to yield. It's too tight, Frank, D'Angelo grunts, his face purple with exertion. The tolerance is too close. It won't seat. Frank drops the drill. He wipes his hands on his coveralls. It'll seat. Hand me the persuader. Grease passes up a 4-pound sledgehammer. This is the part of mechanics that they don't teach in flight school. Sometimes, precision engineering requires brute force. Frank wedges the steel channel against the brake. He creates a buffer with a block of wood, takes a short breath, and swings. Clang. The sound rings through the fuselage like a bell. Clang. With every strike, the heavy steel sleeve inches forward, swallowing the fractured aluminum bone of the aircraft. It groans, protests, and finally, with a dull thud, slides home. The steel now bridges the gap, clamping the broken ends of the longeron together like a doctor setting a compound fracture. It's on, Frank breathes, his arms trembling. Now the hard part, the drilling. Drilling through duralumin, the aircraft skin, is like drilling through hard cheese, easy, smooth. But drilling through high-carbon steel bomb rack plating, that's like trying to drill through a bank vault. For the next 3 hours, the hangar is filled with the high-pitched shriek of drill bits biting into hardened steel. Frank goes through 6 drill bits in 20 minutes. They snap, they dull, they smoke. The metal gets so hot, it blisters the paint on the outside of the fuselage. Keep the cutting oil coming, Frank shouts, barely hearing himself over the noise. D'Angelo is there with a squirt can, dousing the drill tip in oil. Smoke billows up, stinging their throats. They are working in a rhythm of desperation. Drill, oil, curse, snap, replace, drill again. By 0300, 32 holes are drilled through the steel aluminum sandwich. Bolts, Frank commands. They slide the high tensile aircraft bolts through the stack. Washers, nuts. They tighten them down with torque wrenches until their knuckles turn white. The steel splint is now mechanically locked to the airframe. It's strong, Probably stronger than the original plane, but it's not finished. It's going to vibrate loose, Frank says, looking at the assembly. The harmonics of those engines will shake those nuts off in an hour. We can safety wire them, D'Angelo suggests, yawning. Not enough, Frank says. He pulls his welding goggles down over his eyes. We're going to tack it. D'Angelo's eyes go wide. Frank, you can't weld inside the fuselage. The hydraulic lines are right there. The fuel transfer manifold is 3 feet away. One spark. Then get the wet blankets, Frank snaps. Cover everything and stand by with the extinguisher. This is the moment of truth. This is the crazy shortcut. Frank is about to introduce a 6,000-degree electric arc into the belly of a bomber soaked in aviation fuel residue to fuse a steel scavenged from a junk pile onto a combat aircraft. D'Angelo layers wet wool blankets over the hydraulic lines and the fuel pipes. He stands ready with the CO2 extinguisher, his face pale. Eyes, Frank warns. Crack. The arc strikes. Blue light floods the cramped waist section. Frank works fast, laying down short, hot beads of weld on the steel bracket, locking the nuts in place, fusing the splice into a single, immovable unit. The heat radiates off the metal, sweating Frank's face instantly. He counts the seconds. 1, 2, 3, stop. He can't let the heat travel into the aluminum skin, or it will melt. He waits. 1, 2, 3. He strikes the arc again. It is a dance of fire and patience. One slip, and he burns a hole through the skin. One slip, and he ignites the fuel vapors. 30 minutes later, Frank flips his goggles up. The weld is ugly. It's thick, knobby, and industrial. It looks like something you'd see on a bridge, not an airplane. But it is solid. The broken spine is now encased in a rigid steel tunnel. Frank crawls out of the hatch and drops to the concrete floor. His legs give way, and he sits heavily against the tire. He is covered in soot, oil, and metal shavings. He looks at his watch. 4:15 a.m. Is it done? D'Angelo asks, handing him a canteen of water. Frank looks up at the dark belly of the beast. She's stiff as a board. She won't break. Will she fly? Frank takes a long pull from the canteen. We're about to find out. The flight crews are waking up in 45 minutes. Get the paint. We need to cover that steel before the sun comes up, or Reynolds will spot it from a mile away. December 21st, 1943. 7:15 a.m. Hardstand 14, RAF Hethel. The sun is trying to rise, a pale, bloody smear behind the fog. The airfield is awake, a cacophony of engines coughing to life, fuel trucks grinding gears, and the shouting of ground crews. Frank stands by the nose wheel of Ragged Irregular. He has a mug of coffee in his hand, but he hasn't taken a sip. He is watching the waist section. They had painted the steel splice with olive drab dope just an hour ago. It was still tacky. From a distance, it looked like a standard repair patch. But up close, it was a monstrosity. A bulging, lumpy scar on the sleek aluminum skin. It looked like a bandage on a broken leg. A jeep screeches to a halt nearby. It isn't the flight crew. Captain Reynolds steps out. He is back from his administrative leave, and he looks like he's ready to execute someone. He marches straight to the plane, his eyes locking onto the patch. "Miller!" Reynolds shouts over the rising whine of the number 2 engine. "What in God's name is that?" Frank stands his ground. "It's a structural reinforcement, sir. Field expedient." Reynolds walks up to the fuselage. He runs a gloved hand over the lumpy steel hump. He feels the cold, hard, unyielding mass of the bomb rack beneath the paint. He looks at the heavy bolts. That's steel," Reynolds sputters, his face turning red. "You bolted steel channel to an aluminum longeron? Miller, are you insane? The weight differential alone." "It balances out, Captain," Frank lies smoothly. "We adjusted the trim tabs." "I'm grounding this ship," Reynolds snarls, reaching for his clipboard. "This is a violation of every technical order in the manual. If that weld snaps under load—" "If you ground her, Captain," a voice cuts in, "I fly short. And if I fly short, we lose the box formation." It's Lieutenant Halloway, the pilot. He's standing behind them, fully geared up in his flight suit, parachute harness slung over his shoulder. He looks tired, but his eyes are steady. Reynolds turns on him. Lieutenant, this aircraft is not airworthy. It has a bomb rack welded to its spine. It's a death trap. Holloway looks at the plane. Then he looks at Frank. There is a moment of silent communication between the officer and the grease-stained sergeant. They have been through 20 missions together. Frank has patched bullet holes, changed cylinders in freezing rain, and kept Holloway's engines turning when they should have seized. Miller says she'll fly? Holloway asks. I say she'll fly, sir, Frank answers. She's stiff. She won't flex, but she'll hold. Holloway nods. He turns to Reynolds. Captain, get off my hard stand. We have a war to fight. Reynolds opens his mouth to argue, but the roar of the number 4 engine catches, booms, and settles into a steady, thunderous rhythm. The argument is over. The machine has spoken. Reynolds throws his clipboard into his Jeep and storms off, muttering about court-martials. 7:45 a.m., the runway. Ragged, irregular taxis to the threshold. She is heavy, fully loaded with 2,700 gallons of fuel and 5,000 pounds of high explosives. And now, she is carrying an extra 200 pounds of steel in her tail. Frank stands in the grass by the control tower. He lifts his binoculars. Come on, baby, he whispers. The engines roar to full power. The B-24, known as the Flying Brick, even on its best days, begins to roll. It's sluggish. Frank can see it. The nose isn't coming up. The extra weight in the rear is keeping the tail down, dragging on the airflow. Get the nose down, Holloway, Frank mutters. Get the tail up. The bomber lumbers past the halfway marker. It's not flying, it's driving fast. The end of the runway is rushing up, a line of trees that has claimed more than one crew. At 110 miles per hour, the nose wheel finally lifts, but the main gear stays glued to the tarmac. The plane is fighting the weight. It's fighting the Frankenstein surgery in its gut. Up, Frank yells, pull it up. With 50 yards of concrete left, Ragged Irregular shudders and lurches into the air. It clears the trees by inches, the prop wash stripping leaves from the branches. The landing gear retracts slowly, painfully. The plane banks left, joining the assembly circle. It looks heavy. It looks ugly. But it is climbing. Frank lowers the binoculars. His hands are shaking. He realizes he hasn't breathed in a minute. She's flying, D'Angelo says, standing next to him, sounding amazed. That crazy steel spine is actually holding. Frank wipes his greasy face with his sleeve. Flying is the easy part, he says, watching the speck disappear into the clouds. Now she has to take a hit and not break in half. He turns back to the tractor. Come on, we've got 3 engine changes on the Vibrant Virgin to do before they get back. For the next 8 hours, Frank works. But his mind is at 25,000 feet over Germany, wondering if his weld is holding against the flak, wondering if the cold at altitude is making the steel brittle, wondering if he just killed 10 men or saved them. December 21st, 1943. 3:42 p.m. The hard stand, RAF Hethel. The afternoon light is fading, casting long, bruised shadows across the airfield. The first group of bombers has already landed, their crews piling into trucks, exhausted and grim. The board in the operations room shows heavy losses. 2 planes down over the target, 1 ditched in the channel. Frank Miller leans against the fender of the fuel truck, counting. 17, 18, 19. Where is she? D'Angelo asks. He's chewing his fingernails, staring at the gap in the clouds. Then a lone speck appears. It's dragging smoke. It's low. It's flying with that familiar crab-like gait. There, Frank points. Ragged Irregular is coming home. She touches down hard, too hard. The aircraft bounces, the tires squealing in protest, before settling heavily onto the runway. As it taxis toward them, the damage is visible. The nose turret is smashed. The left aileron is shredded. The fuselage is peppered with fresh shrapnel holes, but the tail is still attached. The spine is straight. The engine's cut out, the props spinning down to a clattering halt. The silence that follows is heavy. The waste door pops open, and the crew spills out. They look like coal miners, their faces blackened with soot and frostbite burns. Lieutenant Holloway drops to the tarmac. He doesn't walk to the debriefing jeep. He walks straight to the tail section. He runs his hand over the painted steel hump of Frank's splice. Frank approaches slowly. He's afraid to look. Well? Frank asks, his voice tight. Holloway looks at him, eyes wide with adrenaline. Sparky, we took a hit. Flak burst right under the waist at 24,000 feet. It blew the ball turret gunner's oxygen bottle. It should have snapped the plane in half. The whole ship shuddered like a dying dog. Holloway taps the ugly, bulging steel patch. This thing didn't budge. The aluminum skin around it is rippled from the stress, but the steel? It held like an anchor. Frank steps closer. He inspects his handiwork. There is a fresh, jagged gash in the aluminum skin, just inches from his weld. A piece of flak had tried to sever the spine again, but it had struck the heavy bomb rack steel and deflected. The crazy shortcut hadn't just held the plane together, it had acted as armor. Captain Reynolds pulls up in his Jeep. He steps out, looking at the damage. He looks at the fresh shrapnel scars. He looks at the steel splice, still solid, still defiant. He doesn't yell. He doesn't wave the manual. He takes off his cap, rubs his forehead, and sighs. He knows that by the book, this plane is an abomination. But he also knows that today, it dropped 10 500-pound bombs on a Nazi rail yard and brought 10 American boys home. "Sergeant," Reynolds says quietly. "Sir?" "Get her patched up. We need her for tomorrow." Reynolds gets back in his Jeep and drives away. It isn't a blessing exactly. It is an admission. In this war, the manual is a luxury. Survival is the only rule. Over the next 2 months, the Hethel Patch, as the crews started calling it, became an open secret. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't approved by Boeing. But as the 8th Air Force pushed into Big Week, pounding the German aircraft industry into dust, spare parts became scarcer than gold. Mechanics across the base started raiding the graveyard. They scavenged bomb racks, armor plates, and tractor beams. They learned that a B-24 didn't need to be perfect to fly. It just needed to be strong. Frank Miller never got a medal for his welding. He never got a citation for engineering excellence. His name doesn't appear in the official history books of the strategic bombing campaign. But 6 months later, when Ragged Irregular was finally retired, not because it crashed, but because the engines were simply too worn out to overhaul, Frank stood by the scrap pile and watched them strip her down. When they cut the tail section off, it took 3 diamond-tipped saw blades to get through the spine. Frank picked up a piece of the steel splice, still holding the aluminum together in a death grip. He tossed it in his hand, feeling the weight of it, the weight of the iron, the weight of the lives it carried. "Crazy," D'Angelo said, standing beside him, echoing their words from that freezing December night. "Yeah," Frank smiled, tossing the metal back onto the pile. "But it worked.